Welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast, the show where we help you establish your author brand, increase the size of your audience, and sell more books. I'm Lindsay Baroker, and I'm here with my two co-hosts.
I'm Jeff Poole.
And I'm Joe Lallo.
And we've got a really interesting guest for you this week, Alex Newton from K-Lytics. It's a type of software. I'm going to ask him to describe everything that they do really quickly, but it's going to be all about kind of analyzing the Amazon store and just figuring out what opportunities are out there, or maybe if there's something you could be jumping into maybe a different category that you also are perfect for, and that's a little less competitive. So we're going to be talking mostly about Amazon stuff today, so hopefully that will be of interest to you guys listening. Hi, Alex. Welcome to the show.
Well, hello, and thanks for having me. Good day, everybody.
We are really happy to have you here, and had a few hiccups, so we appreciate you staying up late. Alex is over in Europe, so we're recording early here in the US. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what K-Lytics is, and maybe how you got started with it, and how it can help authors?
Sure. Well, first of all, what does KLytics stand for? I started out with KLytics, but my lawyer 4 years ago said, you don't want to get into a trademark dispute on like day zero. The site was already up as KLytics.com, by the way, at the time. So last minute change of plans, all the graphics were ready. So it's basically Kindle and analytics, in short, KLytics. I got into it like 4 years ago, probably at the high time of the Kindle gold rush, if you will, when, excuse my words, probably every John, Dick, and Harry was told you can get rich by uploading a recipe cookbook or something like that on Kindle. So I have to confess, at the time, I looked at all these Kindle courses. I was deep in the corporate rat race. By profession, I'm a business person. I've been a consultant in the corporate world for 20 years, working with data. And basically my mission was always, let's solve complex problems by looking at the facts and figures and try to present them in a hopefully palatable format. And it was a bit of a coincidence that I got in publishing, although I did start in the corporate publishing world some 20 years ago, a bit longer actually by now. And things came to things. So we started looking at the Amazon platform and started aggregating, and looking at data and genres in a certain way, where I started noticing, hey, you can really tell, whether sci-fi or romance or this or that is bigger than something else. Things came to things in terms of people said, hey, if you do this for categories, can you do this for subcategories? So yeah, sure, let's try. And 4 years later, we're now looking at 5,000 Kindle categories, but it's basically a service, and we will look into many details in what we do, but it's basically not a software. That's very important. We have access to a database. It's not a software tool. We do ready-made genre reports, whether you write in sci-fi or in cozy mystery, we cover these genres for you so that you can focus on what you hopefully do best, which is writing, and we do the research for you and for publishing companies for that matter as well.
All right, very cool. Yeah, I think I was thinking of somebody else that has software, but yeah, I think you're all web-based for the user experience. Is that right?
Yes, a lot is also PDF reports, and we can have a look at, for example, the recent Sci-Fi and Fantasy report, some extracts, because much of the information, you just want to consume the information, but we do have the web-based database where you can basically get carried away and, do the research yourself. And obviously there's tools out there and they're all great and good, but it's a little bit of a distinction of what we do, because one important thing that we want to do is we monitor genres and evolutions over time, because as you know, a sales rank can fluctuate. We measure 25% within any 1 hour period on average, and up to plus or minus 90% in the 30-day period. So if you go on the website now and, with some real-time tools say, whatever, this is trending now, it can lead you totally astray if you don't look at the data over time.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Like, a single measurement is often completely useless because you don't know the context to the measurement. So it seems like, since you're analyzing the performance of different genres and subgenres and sub-subgenres, that this would be very useful if you're planning a book. But let's say you've got a back catalog. Like, is there value to your service to figuring out how to better market books that are already written?
Yes, absolutely. Basically, the service that we do is geared towards two audiences or two purposes. One is, as you say, what to write. So you start out for a project and you want to say, what are the hot markets, etc. The other extreme is you have already a backlog, a back catalog, and you want to relaunch books or tailor them, say, for the Christmas season or something like this. And there the research comes in handy because it can help answering a lot of tactical questions, such as what is the optimal price point in the genre, what is top selling cover art if I refurbish my cover, what are trending keywords, who are the top authors, say, in steampunk right now if I wanted collaboration opportunities, these sort of things. Or sort of in between, you have a portfolio of books, but you want to revisit them and give them a different twist, especially in the romance genre. It comes very handy if you have existing assets that you can tailor a little bit to what's trending at the moment.
You mentioned earlier that you noticed that steampunk was on the rise there. So made me start to wonder, since you're looking for niches which aren't too, for lack of a better technical term, crowded, are there any of the categories that have practically been untouched?
Well, yes. Technically speaking, I can show you. There are basically bestseller lists that have 0 books in it right now. So there is the extreme. So basically you have to come from on Amazon right now. Amazon stopped displaying the information on their website, but they still do increments of 30 days. So we've been tracking how many books are there on Amazon and in each and every genre or subgenre. On Amazon overall, you have more than 6 million ebooks, 4.9 million as English language titles. So if you start on a category level and you have something such as, say, romance, you have like 450,000 books, just ebooks. And then you start breaking it down, and it goes all the way to the extreme. So there are genres out there. Also, actually, in sci-fi, if you go down the path of humor, entertainment, video gaming, if you go into that one, you find categories, there's only 2 books in it. And sometimes it just displays 0 books. So you could be a #1 bestseller just by putting the very book into that category as an extreme or as a hack.
Is there a point of being in a category that nobody's really looking at? Like, are you actually going to sell any books? If, I think probably in all the fantasy and sci-fi subgenres, there are people surfing, but some of these ones where you can become a bestseller with a ranking of 50,000, is there any point to even trying to do that?
Yes and no. Well, first of all, my first answer is no, because obviously you want to look at markets where you have a commercial potential that is reasonable. So especially during the Kindle Gold Rush times, you had all these people saying, oh, I'm a #1 bestseller in how to gardening and horticulture, how to grow bonsai trees, right? And then you see this category rank, which is a #1. But if you look at the absolute store rank, you get whatever, 63,245, and the book is hardly selling anything. So when you do strategically look at genres, and we can have I can show you a couple in the sci-fi and fantasy world in a second, it is important to look at the commercial potential of the whole category. And the commercial potential is defined by obviously supply, how many books are out there. That is competition. You want to minimize that. What is the demand? Ideally, it's very high and reasonable. So if you have a category where obviously the average sales rank across the top 20 titles is, say, 1,000, and you have only 300 books in the category, it can be commercially very attractive, right? But what you want to stay away with is that let's go after a niche that has only 50 books in it and isn't selling a copy. It doesn't make sense at all, obviously. With the one exception where sometimes very tactically people select such categories to earn the bestseller rank. Even Harry Potter does it. People don't know it, right? Harry Potter, I think Harry is an orphan, right? So Rowling and her company put Harry Potter in like teen, young adult, blah, 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 social issues, family issues, orphans, which I think is really a stretch. And obviously the book is doing well per se. However, many times the #1 bestseller badge, when you type in Harry Potter into Amazon, comes not from a main category, but one of these niche categories.
I've definitely seen indie authors do something like that too. Just recently I spotted somebody that was happy they were a bestseller in like the movie tie-in category, and I read their blurb and I'm like, this is not tying into anything. This is original science fiction. So, I mean, I guess it's up to the author right now. It doesn't seem like you get punished at all if you're in a category. You just maybe get irked, other authors irked with you if they genuinely belong in there.
Right. I mean, I'm not advocating this, and obviously there are 50 shades of gray, pun intended, between gaming the system and, you know, really alienating the readers or people who search, and on the other side, doing a legitimate tactical move. I think it's much more important to look at, well, how is steampunk right now doing versus cyberpunk versus military sci-fi, you know, and all these other subgenres from a commercial potential and competition and trend point of view, to make a judgment. Well, my next series, do I take it more in this direction or the other direction?
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like a lot of people listening are just not going to be able to maybe get into the top 100 of the categories where they feel like they would be a good fit. And I've certainly seen people that say they fiddle with the keywords that they're allowed to put in Amazon in order to come up in the search results, which don't seem to have a whole lot to do with the bestseller lists. I know you had a blog post on that, and I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the search results and how they differ.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of important points and concerning both keywords and categories. What people often don't know is when you, for example, type in a very, very broad keyword on Amazon, such as, say, paranormal romance, as a search word into the search bar, then once you click enter, you will get a display of books. But the first thing that happens in that little pull down where you can say search in books or Kindle or in baby accessories, it will default to the category paranormal romance. So all the next things you do and click, happens within the paranormal romance category. So the two things are sort of a little bit interlinked. Sometimes people miss that. Now, the next important thing is when people say, talk about the display of a book on Amazon, it's important to distinguish. There are many views on the book, but there's two major things to distinguish. One is the bestseller list. So if you browse, especially the authors browse the bestseller list, I reckon, right? Not so much the readers perhaps, but if you browse the bestseller list, it's very simple. For a given category, only 100 books are displayed, as you know, and they are in descending order of sales, and that is sales rank. And the sales rank would be driven by either downloads, pre-orders, or the actual sales, right? So both borrows and sales, and nothing else, not reviews, not keywords, nothing. A bestseller list is a bestseller list. What people often don't recognize is if you, however, just in the search bar, put in a search word, that what is then displayed is not ordered in any way by sales volume. There are a number of factors going in, even your own purchasing history, right? So if you purchase just before on Amazon diapers and you look for a book on diapers, you may get like, if you're not in the bookstore, you may get very weird results, right? And so even in the bookstore, please note that if you type something in and you get a book there and you say, oh, that must really be selling, it is not. That is also why we create what we call a virtual bestseller list, where we take all those search results and then actually order them in the sales rank order, which Amazon does not do for you.
For someone who's hoping that maybe they can't get in those top lists, but I remember playing around early in my career, actually trying to come up in steampunk, and I found that, it was kind of hard to tell what affected coming up on that first page of search results for that. I feel like somebody at one point proved or tried to prove that it's not anything based on your book description, so there was no point going like steampunk in the description. Do you have any insight into like how one might come up higher, not just for steampunk, but maybe for like a more specific, less competitive, like science fiction, romance, new books, 2018 as a keyword, that kind of thing?
Right. Well, one important thing about the keywords is if you can define obviously the keywords in the KDP dashboard, those famous or infamous 7 keywords. And these are the keywords in the literal sense. So if somebody has in there a nonfiction book, mating behavior of Chinese vineyard snails, and that is the keyword, and somebody searches for Chinese vineyard snails, that book will come up, right? And that is very important. Now, the other thing, what you can actually do, let me try to, I know we're on the podcast, but for argument's sake, if we share here the screen, you can have a look at Amazon Advanced Search. And people don't do this, but it gives great insights actually onto the fact what really triggers the search result. So the one thing you may want to do here, let me just go here on Amazon actually. So on Amazon here, if you go to the advanced search, which you have in the very right-hand side, if your screen is too small on Kindle, you make it smaller, otherwise Amazon lets it vanish. Now have a look here. What can you actually search on Amazon? So when you put something into the overall search bar, you could also decompose it and specifically search for keywords, authors, title, publisher, and that's it, right? The algorithm will also use category information, and in fact, in the HTML code of the Amazon page, you have category information pushed in there as actually on-page SEO factors. But the point I wanted to make is, you see here, book description is not even there as a search field. So people spend way too much time SEOing their book description, then really doing what a book description in my mind is supposed to do, which is selling the book, right? So the things you really want to optimize is category selection, the famous 7 keywords, the book title, and obviously your author name and publisher name is given. But that is what directly triggers the search bar.
That is an excellent piece of information, because it's amazing how much time people start micromanaging little stuff that it turns out isn't even part of the formula that gets you found. All right, so I actually had an email not too long ago from an author who wanted to ask me if it was more important to have accurate keywords or popular ones. That's to say, like, if you stuff your book with the most popular keywords, does it increase your exposure? And does the increased exposure offset maybe the confusion if the keyword didn't really have anything to do with your book?
Right. I mean, obviously there are extremes, as always. First of all, you shouldn't put the keywords in the book, neither in the book description, but when we say putting in the book, just to be very clear with the person who asked there, it is really about defining the keywords. Now, for the keywords, and the same, by the way, applies for the categories. Now, if you have, for example, put down a category such as, my favorite one is outdoor sports rodeo. If you go into that category, it's a subcategory. You find romance titles in there. You find, so few books that have actually something to do with rodeos. Now, will you alienate the reader? Well, that depends on one thing. If you now type in, say, keto diet book, because these guys sometimes abuse the system, that book, if that is currently ranking #1 in that rodeo category, it will show up in the search with the orange bestseller badge. Let me actually show you what's happening there. So and when that happens, the reader will intuitively click on that very book. So let me show you what can happen here. So if you go into this, the book, if you go on Amazon, for example, and I have this here, if you type in on the Amazon search bar, you type something in here, right? And then for example, the book shows up and has a #1 rank, right? And it gives you this bestseller rank. Now, what's happening here is, for example, here the person put in marketing and it shows up as a bestseller. Now, if you put your book into Rodeos and it's ranking #1 there, but you typed in keto diet because you were searching for a keto diet, you will get a keto diet book that has the orange bestseller book. Only if you hover over that information will it show the reader or potential buyer where that rank is actually coming from. And the issue is that many people, so for example here, Harry Potter, you type it in, it comes up with this bestseller rank. Only if you really go to the book page will the person ever find out where that ranking is coming from. So that is an important piece of information. Now, the one thing you don't want to do is obviously deceive your reader. And that's, I mean, obviously you alienate a person. We've actually done one investigation of 50 Shades of Grey, how many people do keyword hijack 50 Shades of Grey. My favorite one was 50 Shades of Keto or something. No, of Kale. 50 Shades of Kale. Now, to everybody who's listening to the podcast, we looked at 30,000 such books, and it's not worth doing it. They don't have any significant sale over any period in time, so don't do it.
I read somewhere that you'll want to avoid keywords for the categories you have chosen. For example, if you categorize your books as historical fantasy, then there's absolutely no point to put historical fantasy as one of your keywords. Is that true?
It is yes and no. We currently don't have empirical evidence that it harms or benefits you in any way. Amazon is obviously telling you not to do it because they say it's redundant information. I think the technical aspect in it is when you define a category, you basically define a whole path of a category, right? So it would be science fiction and fantasy / epic, and so on and so forth, right? So that is the definition of the category path. Now, if the person puts in epic fantasy, the person who buys, and your book, Amazon will probably recognize, the person is looking for epic fantasy. Your book is in the category epic fantasy. So the information would indeed potentially be redundant. But there are other cases where the category designation is frankly pretty complicated, right? And nobody would type it in that way, or they would search for other things. So here I would potentially have some redundancy. I wouldn't put category romance / historical and then historical romance as a keyword. That I would not do, but you get the idea. Unless the category information is very succinct, you may still want to hint with a keyword to what the book is really about.
That's a good point, because I know in fantasy there's a category like dragons and mythological creatures, which, maybe nobody's going to type all of that in and they're just going to type in dragons. So maybe it's worth using that for a keyword. Right,
because you don't know whether the thing that is then typed in, whether the Amazon really then match it as like a complete match, creatures, dragon, etc., or is it really filtering matching the word dragon anywhere to appear in the category path? And there I sometimes have my doubts, frankly.
I know you mentioned that you guys are just putting together a sci-fi and fantasy report right now for your subscribers. I'm curious if you dug up any, you mentioned steampunk seems to be trending. Are there any subcategories that people working on something right now might want to jump into because they're either newly opened or just seem to be trending upward?
Yeah, I mean, we update the report every half a year, actually. So I'm happy to give you a bit of the information and a little rundown here. It's all because I personally look at so many book markets. It's not all in my head. So if we go into some highlights of the report, and that was literally finished this afternoon, let me share it. So sci-fi and fantasy, first of all, sci-fi and fantasy, it's like 136 submarkets, right? It's really big. And what people don't realize is if you go into the market, most people look at the main category, sci-fi, which is science fiction and fantasy actually, right? And it breaks down into the sci-fi branch and into the fantasy subcategory. And there you then find like 44 subcategories and then 10 even level 4 or 5 categories. So, at the very end of the chain, there is a lot of categories. But what people often miss is you also find a lot of sci-fi and fantasy categories in the other main category. So that just as a side now, and that opens up like a huge market. So for example, you would find dark fantasy would be actually in literature and fiction / horror / dark fantasy as just one of the examples. But if you guys are interested more like what is trending, well, let's have a look here. First of all, good news is sci-fi, if you compare it to all the other big categories, what people often don't realize is Amazon Kindle is basically defined by 3 to maximum 4 genres. Romance, number 1, then mystery, thriller, suspense, and then actually all the time it has been sci-fi, not nonfiction as the big umbrella one, and then a little bit of teen and young adult, and then it really niches down. So sci-fi is really still right now one of the big markets on the Kindle platform. Now, you asked earlier, I think, Joseph, was which way to go. If you just look at the helicopter level, this is now the data over the 4 years, how the top part of the Amazon sci-fi fantasy bestseller list has been trending. And for both sci-fi and fantasy, it has sort of peaked in January 2016. And then for the last years, you see here a slight downward trend, still in absolute terms on a very attractive level. But this is when you look at the market like very, very helicopter perspective, or what you say in your language, like 50,000 feet or God knows how many thousand feet, right? So overall, still doing well, but there's a bit of a, downward trend, if ever so slightly. Fantasy has been slightly ahead of sci-fi. So, and that is always a little bit of a race between sci-fi and fantasy. So if you look over time, the red line here, for those on the podcast, there's like 2 lines, over time. One is fantasy, one is sci-fi. So on Kindle, probably also owing to the demographics of the typical Kindle and reader who's female, a little more fantasy than science fiction is being sold. And from there, you can really start drill it down and down and down. So you can then say, well, what is currently trending? So here we have 18 months data. And here's a very important point. So for example, the one bestseller list in sci-fi and fantasy that showed the highest sales rank improvement over the last 18 months was science fiction, fantasy Arthurian. And here comes an important point where we also get in the discussion of category pollution, right? Because if you go into the category, you will find some of the people are like legitimate, like Arthurian fantasy authors. A couple of other ones, you find a lot of urban fantasy in there, also, I guess Michael Underley and the teams, there's a bit urban fantasy going on as well. So obviously when you look at the data, you also have to look at behind it, what is really driving the trend. In some cases, it's like spot on. In some cases, you really have to also check a bit for false positives. But for example, what you mentioned earlier, what else is trending? I see in many Facebook forums, hey, superhero on the back of blockbusters has been doing well. This is the fantasy superhero bestseller list over time, over the last 18 months, and you see how it's climbing and climbing. Also, this is where the rumor and hearsay in various Facebook forums, K-boards, or whatever, start dovetailing with the data. And the other ones, cyberpunk, the bestseller list has been trending upwards, and so has steampunk. The ones that are going more downward, as an example, is dystopian. After the whole Hunger Games stuff has been over a bit, it's slightly trending down. But I think what I'm skipping here, what is important to notice is Galactic Empire. These trends are really subtle, but if we go outside the sci-fi main category, just mentioning it, not going there in the report. The whole religious sci-fi and inspirational sci-fi has been trending down a bit, just to give you a little bit of a taste here.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And for anybody listening on through your iTunes, your podcatcher, this may be one where you want to pop into YouTube whenever you get a chance. We do have a YouTube channel if you didn't know, and because we're getting some great information here. Alex is doing a screen share and actually showing us his reports as he speaks about them. So if you're curious and actually want to see it, you can definitely pop in and check out the YouTube video too.
Right. And if you want, before I stop the screen share, because we had the discussion earlier, you had the discussion about like the commercial potential of like tiny categories versus big categories. And there's one thing which, to people, new to us, it's a bit like a snowflake type of picture. Here, by the way, top selling cover art right now in both sci-fi and fantasy and keywords. This is what I still wanted to show you. There is an interesting picture. If we just take science fiction here, for example, this I'm showing now for the people on the podcast a seemingly very complicated picture, but it's actually very, very simple. It's basically a graph that has many, many dots on it, and every of the dot on that graph, it's like a snowflake, represents a category. And they're like big yellow dots. These are the sci-fi categories, and their position on the exhibit basically depends on two factors. How big is the category? So how competitive is it? And how well is it selling? So how high is the sales rank? So in very simple terms, if the blob is very far to the right, like here, we're talking like big mainstream categories where you have here in excess of like 40,000 books in the category. If you go to the left-hand side of the graph, you find blobs which are in categories that have less than 1,000 titles in it. And if you go very high up on the chart, like it's a green zone for those who are just listening, these are ones where the sales are over proportionally high compared to the level of supply. So this is where basically you could argue this is where I come from the business side. This is where demand is like a bit outweighing supply. And this data will basically show you how, and the same picture can be drawn for fantasies. So you see there's a lot of niches still left. And for example, the whole discussion I know in various Facebook forums and the Vegas guys, there's always a discussion about, for example, sci-fi military. It's been trending a little sideways and down, but in absolute terms, it's a genre where the average sales rank of the top 20 titles would always be around 1,500, and the top players are really like make big money in there. But right now in the category, you still have only 491 English-speaking titles in start of July, which is like super minute, right? It's very, very small. And this way you can basically this is basically what we do. You asked at the beginning, what do we do? So we try to look at this market situation over time to give you a picture of what is selling, but also where is it still commercially viable.
Right, and we've talked about before on the show how sometimes it's like traditional publishing is not touching these niches either because they're too small or maybe in the current climate they're not politically correct. And sometimes that can be a great opportunity for an indie author to jump in and do really well if that's something they enjoy writing about anyway.
Totally, and I think you mentioned a very, very important factor. What I've just shown is the numbers part, but what I tell the people I work with is you need to find a match between your passion and the market, right? This like totally puristic right to market view. I mean, I've seen a couple of people say, well, I'm just writing whatever vampire romance. I hate vampires, I hate romance, but I'll do it, right? And having done so for the past 10 years, and they're utterly unhappy and not even making money, right? On the other end of the spectrum, we have people who write with great authenticity. For example, you have You have authors in, say, military romance, right? Navy SEAL romance. A lady whose son is a Navy SEAL, and she loves the whole environment. It's a secondhand experience, but there's a very high affinity. Match that with the numbers we have on military romance, and yes, it is a crowded genre, but the demand is over proportionally high compared to many other romance genre. Take things like sports romance or gothic romance. These are, and then it gets even further down, like niche-wise, motorcycle club romance. Huge demand-wise. Okay, you have to deduct the scammers, but it's huge. And yes, the traditional publishers don't touch it. It's like hot coal. But that is where the money is actually being made by the indies. And I've just looked at a couple of bestseller lists. Take things like, there are a couple of genres where both now really start competing. Take things like vigilante justice or female protagonist, mystery and thriller. This is where you now have both worlds like compete head on. Or recently we investigated clean romance, big trend towards cleaner romance, right? People get tired of 50 Shades of Grey, and this is where you have the big traditionals now competing head on with the indies and vice versa. And I have to say the indies are doing really well.
You mentioned that when people are surfing through some of these categories to maybe check out the competition or see if they can get in them, like with the Arthurian, that there's probably some paranormal romance in the Arthurian. Do you think there's a way, like, is that affecting the data in a big way, like for the trend upward? Are people actually wanting more Arthurian fantasy, or is it just that there happen to be more popular books that don't really fit the category being stuck in the category?
Both things happen. In the case of Arthurian, for example, you have to really look into the category and see what books and subgenres are really driving it. Although there's a little bit of Arthurian going on also on the back of the whole gaming community and these sort of things, right? There are others where you have like really what I call false positives. So there was a time before Amazon purged the books, which was there is an organized crime category in the mystery, thriller, and suspense branch, right? And it really showed in one of these graphs, like, climbing, sales went up and up and up. And so we looked at it actually as part of our mystery, thriller, suspense genre research. And then we found out it's all false positives because it was essentially the whole street romance, gang romance, bad boy romance, which often has an organized crime element, had been put into that category. Amazon purged a whole number of these books. But either way, we're actually not so worried about category pollution, because there's two ways out. The one is you look at the books, and either way, if you find out, well, it's not real organized crime mystery or cozy mystery novels, but it is organized crime romance driving it, you still know, that's the trend, right? So both paths lead to Rome. And the other thing that, however, we do is there are many genres that cut across categories. So take, for example, female protagonist mystery, thriller, suspense. Hugely trending, but there is no category for it. There's a filtering opportunity on the left sidebar where you could filter for female protagonists in the Kindle store. But since authors and publishers don't put in that keyword that's required to put the book in there, it's completely useless. So in that case, what we did, we looked at like 40, 50,000 mystery, thriller, suspense books, and we ran the titles and book descriptions against a first name database of 16,000 names, English first names, right? Female names. And we looked at the weighting of female pronouns versus male pronouns in the book description. And thus you start getting like a real female protagonist, mystery, thriller, suspense, bestseller list, who the best authors are, the best publishers. So there are cases where you have to go away from the categories, but really look at the search results that we discussed earlier.
Well, we first say that is some top-notch deep dive on trying to figure out where the actual sales are going. But all right, so let's say female protagonist is a good example. I have a lot of books that have a female protagonist. I have until now not really made one of my keywords female protagonist, for example. If I was to go through now and update and add as one of my 7 keywords female protagonist, would that have an impact, or is this sort of thing that requires a relaunch to really take advantage of?
Well, in that very case, it could actually be of help because I don't know by heart the estimated traffic numbers for female protagonists, but the very word female protagonist, readers do look for certain protagonists when they search for books. So there is searches like female protagonist thriller or female protagonist crime, these sort of things. For sci-fi, I wouldn't know what the search volume is. In mystery, thriller, suspense, there is definitely readers who put it in. So if you do put it as a keyword, it can help move the needle a little bit. However, having said this, I think then doing also a relaunch where you then look at who are the other authors who are specifically successful with female protagonists, how to collaborate with them in the indie world, then obviously that carries a bigger weight than just playing around with a keyword.
I've often found that in order to appeal to the most readers as possible, that a frequent adjustment to the keywords becomes handy. Of course, I've also heard that changing the keywords more frequently, more than, let's say, once a month, can hurt the book's visibility within Amazon's search algorithms. Do you know if any of that's true?
Some of it is true to my understanding for a very technical reason. So there's 2 things that you can play with, obviously, the category data and the keyword data. The category data is interesting because, especially also when Google, for example, crawls the Amazon site, if you, for the real geeks on the podcast, if you use a Chrome browser and I think Control U or something displays the HTML source code of the page, and if you do that and then Control Find, try to find keywords, it will take you to the metadata of the actual Amazon page, but you have to do it on a clean page, not one that comes from a search result, like a clean direct URL to the book. And what you find there is category data pushed by Amazon into the SEO, into the on-page SEO. So for how it appears not on Amazon, but how it also appears to a Bing bot or to a Google bot, right? So playing around and optimizing with that, I always say keep some categories constant because they will accumulate data. Like in SEO terms, I think people would also say something like link juice. It's technically not the same, but if people keep clicking on that thing, the clicks are associated with that category. The same will apply. Amazon is learning that certain keywords may have been clicked on after the search, clicked on your books. They accumulate the data. So it's like link juice. If you change the category, it can technically potentially wipe that data. So both for categories and for keywords, for the lack of knowing somebody in the Amazon A9 team who could specifically tell you the weighting of these factors, I tend to recommend let's keep a core of categories and keywords constant. They are accumulating things, and then use the other, especially now that you can have 10 categories or even more when you have an Amazon representative, use that as your playing chips to optimize and try to get both worlds combined.
Yeah, that's a good point that you can have more than the categories or the keywords, because you can just email them now and they'll usually, if you want to get into a category that is not selectable from the KDP dashboard. Now, for those that don't know, you can email them and say like, hey, can you put me in dragons and mythological creatures?
Very important point. They changed it back in February last year. It's been around for a whole while. And my understanding was that like high ticket authors actually got a mail from Amazon notifying them of the change, while others did not. And on top of it, if you are a big hitter author and have a Amazon representative, you get into even more category. So just last month, I looked at the Bella Forrest books, like the Gender Game series and stuff. Bella has her book in 17 categories at any point in time. Now, whether that is good or bad for the reader is on a different sheet of music. I'm not commenting that, but you get the idea.
Right, and you mentioned Harry Potter before, and that's the same way some of the and Game of Thrones I've seen in like comedy, like what? You mentioned in one of your blog posts, and we should point out that K-Lytics has a blog, and there's some very interesting videos and things up there if people want to check it out. In one of them, you mentioned an ebook market success formula. Can you just talk about, I know we've been talking about like kind of the right to market and finding the right niche where maybe it's easier to do well. If it's of interest to you to write in that, is this along the same lines or is that something different?
Well, that was one of my very first blog posts. It's very like consulting corporate business speech almost, if you will, but it's an interesting point because it tries to balance those factors, supply, demand, so the market side of things. It tries to bring in another discussion. So one is market versus passion. And I already said you should try to get an overlap, right? And if you're in nonfiction, a third factor actually comes in, which is authority, right? You may want to write with passion. You may not even care about the sales that you have with Kindle, but you want to have that #1 bestseller badge to prove authority to then earn your money with whatever, a YouTube channel or personal consulting, you name it. So that is one part of the discussion. The other part of the discussion is about the whole thing of quality versus quantity. Huge discussion. So I'm a numbers guy, and when the Kindle Gold Rush hit, I started doing the numbers. So if you wanted to earn, I cannot give it all by heart now, but if you wanted to earn $100,000 with books, well, what is the average sales rank you need? If you have 5 books, what would be the average sales rank that has to be maintained over 365 days? At what price point and what royalty percentage to make that money? So can you actually make it with one book? You do the numbers, virtually impossible. Do you have to do 300 books? You do the numbers and say, no, it probably doesn't have to be. Do you have to be prolific? Yes, you have to be, because there is also churn. We once did an analysis on how much new books versus old books are in the bestseller list, and the split is a bit 50-50. You have books that are there for more than a year, and then there's also the churn. And the last part that was part of that discussion you mentioned there, Lindsay, is the whole point about also differentiation. So what sets you apart from the competing authors, although I know indies don't necessarily refer to their fellow author as competitor, but what makes you different? Why should the person buy your book? And that's where a whole lot of factors obviously come together.
All right. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about how there are genres and subgenres that are so utilized that you can become a bestseller very easily, just basically by saying that you're in that genre. And then you get your little bestseller flag. I guess my question would be, once you get that flag, does that flag translate into better sales? Like, how valuable is the bestseller flag?
You can basically judge yourself if you go on Amazon with the pair of glasses of a consumer, with the viewpoint of a consumer. If you search something and you go onto Amazon now and you type in whatever, you're looking for a book on whatever, you can take fiction or nonfiction. The nonfiction examples are so easy, right? So you say you want to have a book on the paleo diet, right? So you type in paleo diet, and you're immediately presented, what you don't know as a consumer is, what Amazon might hide by now, is that there are 45,000 titles, or type billionaire romance, right? So the page 1 is obviously decisive, but then look at the psychology. If you as a consumer, I notice myself, when you look, now I don't have like the scientific, the heat map of consumers clicking on Amazon. They will have, but the strong hypothesis is that you will click on the books that have the orange badge more than you will click on the other search results that don't have it. And that's why people try to game exactly that system. Could I tell you whether it makes 5%, 10%, 40% sales increase? Or even negative? I wouldn't know, but if I were to bet on it, I'd rather have the orange badge than not.
If you don't mind me asking, can I ask you what your success rate is with your clients? Has anyone that used your services seen an increase in sales, or have you heard any feedback about that?
Well, first of all, I would never claim that K-Lytics is one of the many, many wheels. In essence, we are a market research company. So Coca-Cola, may come out with a new product, or they're selling Coke and they're consistently doing market research about what's happening in the world. If you then ask the Coca-Cola CEO, what percentage increase of sales have you had because you used a market research study to determine your strategy, you will say no clue. Now, I really don't like to mention these numbers because they're not, repeatable. And now there are many services out there that say, hey, do this with me and you will have an increase in sales of 40%. I don't do that. I had people who just changed their categories into that thing. They had the orange bestseller bitch and they had overnight like 20% more downloads. I had others who changed it and had exactly that factor that we discussed earlier, where certain link juice, the algorithm has learned something about the book, and that was completely lost because the person changed every category. And she came back and said, hey, Alex, I have a drop in sales. How is that? Right. So what I do say, however, is what we have. I take the client satisfaction, if you allow my 5-second sales pitch here, very seriously. Every person is asked, would you recommend the service to a client, to a friend or family member? And out of a score from 0, not at all, to 10, extremely likely, we have an average right now of 8.95, and I'm very proud of it. So for me, I would never advertise, use this and it's the silver bullet, because it's not. Because I believe the starting point is a good book, and then it's a good book well marketed, and the well marketed part will be covers, blurbs, categories, keywords, newsletters, fan base, advertising, you name it. Once they work in unison, you will move the needle. So I consider us more a part of an equation than a silver bullet.
It actually seems like you guys would be great for publishers or any prolific authors who are putting out a lot of books a year and maybe are interested in writing more to the market, or at least as much, than just following their passion and then trying to market it. And it's a monthly service, isn't it? Is it kind of like you can pop in and check out your sci-fi and fantasy report, and then they can decide each month if they want to continue on?
Well, basically, we try to make it as accessible to as possible for any audience, whether that is a monetary criteria or are you multi-genre versus single genre. So if you wanted to get your feet wet and you say, I'm a sci-fi author, I always will be, and I'm just sci-fi or cozy mystery, you can come to our shop and just purchase a single report, which is going to be a great deal, right? You pay like $37 or something, get a video complete report, and it will probably have saved you weeks and weeks of research. And I dare say there is information in the reports you couldn't even generate on your own. So we try to keep it as accessible as possible to the indie community. On the other end of the spectrum, we have some authors who are just simply interested in all the other. As soon as you go more than one genre, or you are in sci-fi and say, but what's going on in urban fantasy, what's going on in romance, you'll be better off with with one of the various memberships. And then like one end of the spectrum is what we call our elite service, where you can basically filter search yourself in the whole database of like more than 3,000 genres on a monthly basis. Use it for optimizing your portfolio, or have your virtual assistant use it to optimize your categorization, on a periodically. And publishers do use it too. So it's a bit difficult because we try to serve from the fledgling author who just got into one of these Facebook groups and says, hey, I'd love to write something, to the corporation. It's a very broad spectrum, but you should be able to find something that suits your needs.
All right, and very cool. And I have a couple more questions just that you made me think of while you were
Sure.
talking today before we let you go. Just a minute ago, you were talking about the churn and how that's kind of a natural thing on Amazon, and maybe they want to show like the new stuff. Like I noticed with the Amazon AMS ads, they've started showing like, oh, this is a new release, or this was just released in May. Do you have any thoughts on kind of that versus people who are using AMS ads or whatever, Facebook BookWeb ads, to just continually keep their book in the top 20 of their category, even if they're spending thousands a month. If it's still profitable, it makes sense for them to do that. Do you think Amazon discourages that or encourages that? I know as a reader, I actually like to see new stuff every few months in the charts, but authors, of course, want their books to keep selling.
Right. I mean, from like the grand scheme of things is we looked at, I think, 2,000 categories over time and just had a look. Well, is it new? I think the blog post was fresh or vintage. Is it fresh books or is it vintage books? And vintage being older than a year, which one could argue a year is even not that fresh anymore. And there are a couple of facts about it. The split is, as I said earlier, 50-50 if you look across all the categories. But there are some categories where what we call the retention of a book in the top sales is not as high. So if you take like a fast-moving romance category, you will easily have only like 10% of the books, or 8%, or sometimes less, of the books in the top 100 were there a year ago. In other genres, especially also nonfiction, partly extremely sticky, you know. And then obviously there's the classics, and so to speak. Now, the big question that you ask is, what is driving that, and how does your marketing or ad expense help keeping the thing up there? In the end of the day, Amazon will optimize what ads will actually show based on the clicks and the buy through of these things. So if you keep putting money into these ads and people keep buying them because you're showing it to different people for some reason, then, you know, the book will, Amazon will definitely not punish, at least from the person I know, told me, will not punish the ad in the algorithm.
All right. I just had one last question, a pretty quick one. Do you take price into consideration when you're doing your stuff? And does price seem like it has any strong correlation to the performance of a book?
That's an excellent question. And yes, there is some data on it. Now, what people often confuse is, and we can actually why don't we take a real example? Because it would be it's not true to say, you know, per se, the lower price, you know, triggers the more revenue, the higher price. Basically, the whole thing starts with genre. Every genre has a certain pricing distribution and price levels. Actually, if you go into nonfiction maritime law, you have books that are as expensive as $200 plus, right? So it's huge. Romance has the worst prices, unsurprisingly. It's sometimes above just $3 for measuring the top end, sometimes lower. But what I want to drive it, and we can look once more at onto the SciFi study, because what I try to look at is pricing distribution, and that is an important factor, which means, do you actually price the book in the sweet spot that is relevant for your very genre? So as an example, if we go into sci-fi, you can look at a very high level, okay, how do the prices develop over time, right? So, but that can be helpful. But if you look at it, if you know, for example, here you have the helicopter view, where sci-fi as a price point across the top 100 as a measure, as an indicator, is at 444, you know, lower than many other categories. But would you price your book at 444? Obviously, no, it's just an average. You can say, well, what do the prices over time? Is it currently under pressure or not? But even that may not help you for the tactical decision as a publisher. So what you get really interested in is, if you take, for example, urban fantasy as an example. Now, in urban fantasy, if you look at books in urban fantasy for a pricing distribution, then it gets interesting, and then one can actually start answering your question. Because if you go into a pricing distribution. What you can do in this case, this is based on like 10,000 urban fantasy books, and they would really be urban fantasy, not paranormal romance. So in this case, you see, even surprisingly, the top 20 sellers, 40% of the top 20 sellers had a price point of $4.99. I use urban fantasy because that is one of the very counterintuitive examples. So the books who really made it into the top end had a price point of $3.99 and $4.99, right? All other books had a sweet spot of a $3.99 pricing. More books did $3.99 versus $2.99. So this is one example where you can tell two things. The one is, well, there is a sweet spot between they're either $3.99 or $2.99. That's more than 50% of the market. And you can argue, if you do a promotion, should that be an advertising promotion and or a pricing promotion? It seems that some people, get away with not necessarily discounting the book, but driving traffic to the book. In other categories, and obviously you have to also monitor it over time. In other categories, I could have shown you a romance example. You have a certain price distribution, which is, say, the majority would be $2.99. But if you look at the top end of the market, you have like a 40% share of $0.99 titles. So it shows you that there, yes, the lower price will trigger the effect of you really getting up there. So sorry for the long answer, but it is a bit of a complicated matter. And the other thing is then obviously looking at the, to maximize the revenue that is behind it and not just the sales volume, if that is of help.
I was going to ask you about box sets. I mean, do you have any data about them? Can a box set, which covers a wide range of subgenres within the same category, fare any better with visibility and rankings?
You're giving me a super homework for the next podcast.
Sorry.
No, it's a great question. The one thing I do know from the data about Bookset is if we do these, what we call virtual bestseller lists for whatever genre, the urban fantasy we just looked at, it's interesting to see what percentage of books are actually box sets that you find in the top 100. And what we did find is that obviously varies by genre, but the numbers are not huge. You always find like 8%, 10% of the top 100. So out of 100 books that lead the chart, there could be like 6, 7, 8 box sets. But they are usually just from, recalling what box sets have I seen, they were genre specific, or they were a genre sampler. So whatever, paranormal romance, read The Vampire, read The Shifter, read The Angel, The Ghost, and there's one bit for it. What I frankly haven't seen it, the extreme examples virtually don't exist. And I also haven't seen many here, get the cozy mystery together with the whatever romance. Maybe worth a trial, but I haven't seen in the data, but you give me a good homework. I will start monitoring that.
It seems like the box sets have been a little less popular, and you've probably seen this last couple of years since Amazon capped how many pages you can get credited for with the Kindle Unlimited program.
Yeah. Having said this, you still find, we had the urban fantasy one. We can also do not a price distribution, but we always have in the reports a book length distribution. So is the book more like 200 pages, 300? What is the sweet spot for a very specific genre? And you always get the distribution, and then you get, on the very right-hand side of the graph, you have like the percentage of books with more than 2,000 pages, or more than 500, more than 1,000 pages. So I'd say you still right now, any bestseller list you look at, you have like 9%, 10%, 12% of books that are far outlier. And then it's always interesting to click down into them. And yes, you have probably by now the majority is legitimate box sets. Others are still scammer book stuffing stuff where the book is also quickly vanishing again.
Yeah, it'll be interesting for you to watch, I guess, since you're collecting that data to see if, because right now Amazon is coming down on a lot of the book stuffers, as I'm sure you've seen too. So
Yes.
that maybe if in a year, if the average pages comes down in some of those categories.
Yes, yes. We did look at, I mean, some things are really interesting when you look at them in the long term. And you guys have been in the industry for a while now, and you remember the day when we moved from Kindle 1.0 to 2.0, and we went from the full price to the page reads. And we were probably all part of the big uproars in the K-boards and Facebook groups and you name it, about whether you're worse off or better off, right? At the time, we looked at it, it was, I think if the book was longer than 45,000 words, you were, that was basically the cutoff point, whether you were better off or worse off as an author. But then what happened was really interesting. At the time, the Kindle Unlimited share of all the, at the time, 3.9 million books, now we have 6 million books. What was the share of Kindle Unlimited books before and after? And we measured it like every 12 months. And in Kindle 1.0, it was like 29.3% books, Kindle Unlimited or equivalent. A year later, 29.3%, to the 10th of a digit, it was like the same percentage. So there was all this uproar. I'm going to leave KU. I'm going to leave Kindle, da, 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 da. And nothing changed whatsoever. Obviously, in the individual microcosm, things change, but there's also a lot of inertia in the overall book market.
Right. I've heard from people that are like, I'm going to get out, and then they go out and they don't instantly become a bestseller in the other stores. And so they're like, I'm making less money, I'm going back in. So
Right.
It's been interesting to watch and participate in, for sure. And I guess that we've come up on an hour here, so we should probably let you go. It's probably bedtime over there. We really appreciate you coming on, Alex. It's been some great information. Do you want to mention your service and your website again so people know where to go? And you have an urban fantasy report also, I think, that came out recently, and the sci-fi and fantasy one people may want to check out.
I mean, yes, of course. If you do want to check us out, it's at K-Lytics.com, K-Lytics.com. And then from there, you can get into the shop or to the memberships. I think, Lindsay, we can also put your link into the podcast if you want. And in any case, it's been a great pleasure talking to you guys. And I've taken my homework. If you or your audience has more questions, you can always shoot me a mail at support@KLytics.com, just in the subject line, do podcast or something, so it will be channeled to me. And I also love an ongoing dialogue. So, if you, now that we got to know each other in sci-fi and fantasy a bit, it's always interesting to say, well, okay, a year later, how have things developed? So I'm happy to jump back on if you have more questions going forward, or want to simply look at, well, that was 2018. How do things look in 2019?
Oh, we're going to hold you to it.
Please do.
Yeah, that would be great. There's so few people that have that outside perspective, and like we were saying, can see what's going on with all the authors, not just our own personal experiences. All right, so yeah, it's been very valuable, and we will definitely hit you up maybe next year and see if you can join us again. Thank you, Alex, and thank you for listening, everyone. This is episode 190, if you're looking for the show notes, and I will put the links into your blog and your main page there. So thanks, everyone, and have a good week.
Thanks for hanging out with us, Alex. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
So long, everybody.